now that you are mostly here, I can also turn off my emails. So today we will be looking at clusters, cluster analysis, and management. You all remember our famous framework, starting with the endowments, the resources at the very bottom. We have said that having resources, natural resources, are important. They are important sources of inherited prosperity, but they are not enough for creating competitiveness. Then we moved up to the two layers, the macroeconomic and microeconomic determinants of competitiveness. In the middle layer, for the macroeconomic determinants, we had the institutions for human development and politics, and we also had the monetary fiscal policies that would enable us economic stability. Finally, at the very top, we looked into, in our earlier sessions, company operations and strategy. We looked at how companies can make themselves competitive with their resources and capabilities. We also looked at the quality of the national business environment. We looked at the diamond model, trying to explain what external factors in the country, in the region, contribute to the company's competitiveness. Today, as the last box in the upper layer, we will look at clusters. Clusters, by definition, are, as we, I think, mentioned during our first session, different from the definition of industries, because when we talk about industries, we are only focusing on companies. So our competitors who are in the same industry, as well as other actors along the value chain, including, for example, our suppliers and also distributors. But when we say the cluster, we also have, on top of all the companies in the industry, we also have in the same geographically close area. So when we say geographically close, we are talking about distances that you can meet with each other within a 1 day's travel distance. So we are not talking about 1 day's travel distance by plane, but by car, for example. So it would be a cluster. The Jyväskylä area would be considered, the central Finland area could be considered a geographically close area. So the whole country sometimes can be considered as geographically close, especially when we talk about small countries like Switzerland or Austria. These could be geographically close areas. For Finland, maybe this isn't so true. We could think about the southern part of Finland as close, but as we go towards Lapland to the north, that isn't so close. The important thing of this proximity, closeness, is that we should be able to see each other, meet with each other, exchange knowledge with each other. So this is a bit different than virtual communication that we are doing at the moment. It's more about not only formal meetings, but also for social, informal meetings that create the feeling of trust between the people. We will see later on why this trust is important and why that trust, according to the theory, is more possible when people are near to each other. In the definition of the clusters, we see also, in addition to actors in the industry, also related industries. So it's not only the current industry we are in, but also industries which share activities, skills, technologies, channels, or even customers. So the idea of the related industries is that we can come up with maybe innovations not only by cooperating with actors in our own industry, but also with actors in technologically related industries. Perhaps the main difference from the industry of the cluster is the role of the supporting institutions. Nations, policymakers, they have realized that companies are not innovating only by themselves, that they are also in cooperation with so-called supporting institutions. And here we can see the actors, the supporting institutions. So they could be, for example, the research institutions. These actors are very important in especially knowledge-intensive industries where innovations are coming from new knowledge. So research and development activities, cooperation of companies with research institutes is very important in these kinds of clusters. Another important actor is education institutions, because these education institutions, especially we talk about here the higher education institutions, universities of applied sciences, colleges, they provide the skills for the company. So educate, they train not only the future skills, but also the company's existing employees. So this is a bit about human resource development. We have already discussed that human resources as factor conditions is one of the key conditions as advanced factors. So human resource development, not only young graduates like yourselves, but also we talk about lifelong learning. The employees at companies, they update their skills by participating in programs at these institutions. So they are also very important. Capital providers, these include a variety of actors starting from, for example, banks, but also going to, let's say, venture capitalists who would be investing in new risky initiatives. Business angels, so they are important actors for companies as they provide the capital for especially the growth of existing companies or startups that have new business ideas, new innovations. The government, of course, is also an influential actor. As we remember from the diamond model, perhaps this is a bit different. The cluster concept has embraced a more active role of the government than the diamond model. There in the diamond model, we had the 4 determinants: the factor conditions, demand conditions, related and supporting industries, and the context for firm strategy and rivalry. And then we had 2 external actors, one being the government, the other being the chance events. And the model suggested that those 2 actors, they don't impact directly on the quality of the business environment, but they impact via the 4 determinants of the diamond model. Now, if we think about the current situation with the coronavirus, we can call it as a chance event that affects almost all of us. And here, especially in these kinds of events, we see the role of the government as a key influential actor. In many of the countries, the government has been supporting businesses for their loss of business. The interest rates they have been lowering the interest rates to pump capital for those who need. And as we know, the current situation unfortunately will have economic negative impacts as many places are closing, airlines are not flying, restaurants are closing, So this will unfortunately have many economic impacts on businesses and also social impacts on the societies, as unfortunately some of the people will be maybe losing their jobs. So in order to intervene with this, we see the governments coming up with plans how to support the businesses and how to support the societies. Now, next to this cluster model, we have also a couple of other concepts I have shared with you at the top that have been developed to understand especially the innovative performance of regions, innovation performance of regions. Triple helix model, for example, that has been considering as key actors the university, industry, and the government. Now in the cluster model, we see the firms as the key actors in driving the innovations. They are at the center of the model. In the triple helix model, we see the university as a key actor, as they are the ones that are engaged in research, as they are the ones that generate new knowledge and also raise the future skills who will be employed by the companies. This can be, of course, debated which is the more influential actor. Is it the firms? Is it the research institutions? Well, the triple helix model that was also criticized, and we can also share the same criticism for the cluster model, with the question, where are the buyers? Where is the society? So if you look at the actors that are in the cluster model, we don't see the people. So some researchers, they came up with the idea of the quadruple helix model, where they integrated the three actors of the triple helix and added to them the society. As we know, of course, today, especially in open innovations, the society, the people are very much integrated as end users to the innovation process. So in that respect, that can be a very valid criticism for the model. How should we integrate the society? There were also some researchers who went further to develop or suggest that we should also integrate the nature, the natural environment around us as the fifth sphere, as the fifth helix, and they came up with the so-called quintuple helix model. Of course, adding a number of actors is perhaps giving a better picture of the reality, but at the same time, making studies and analyzing so many actors is not so easy. So it makes implementation analysis more difficult as we add more actors to the model. So in that respect, we should think about what kind of model would be the useful model among the possibilities that I have just shared with you. But now, for the time being, we will stick with the cluster model. Now, why are clusters important? Why? Starting from especially the 2000s, especially in Europe and the US, following the work of Michael Porter in late 1990s, clusters have been embraced as key policies by many countries. In the European Union, so-called the Innovation Union, where the population is aging, and especially if we think about the Western Europe, and also at the same time, growth is declining, and we all experienced the 2008 global financial crisis. The policymakers in the European Union thought of the cluster policies as an influential way to foster, to stimulate growth in European regions. So why was it so that clusters were seen as important? Well, first, they are argued to be increasing productivity in the region. So here we are talking about an agglomeration of actors. Now, just putting the actors together is not enough. What is important is that we should stimulate knowledge transfer between these actors. So knowledge transfer between these actors through more communication, formally or informally, is argued to bring new innovations into the market. So we are talking about more innovations, and with these innovations, commercialization and business, formation of new businesses. So innovations, and we commercialize them, and we form new businesses, and that stimulates economic growth in the region. So clusters were argued to be more influential in increasing innovations, productivity, and new business formation, and simply because it was argued that people will be innovating if people from different backgrounds with knowledge cooperate with others. So this cooperation will only occur if people trust each other. So imagine the two alternative scenarios. One, let us assume that you, as French-speaking students, knowledgeable students with different backgrounds, talk with each other, communicate with each other, and come up with new ideas. Well, of course, coming from the same country background, perhaps you trust each other more, compared with the scenario where we would have, let's say, 10 students or 10 knowledgeable experts from 10 different countries. It would take much longer for those 10 different national experts to start trusting each other before they share the critical knowledge with each other. So trust is argued to be the key factor why local clusters will be delivering more innovations and new businesses. Following from this, I think we should look at trying to understand the key actors in the cluster. So we had some kind of a map in the beginning, and what we should perhaps do as a first task in especially this is something I would ask for your group project, is to identify the actors in your cluster by drawing a cluster map. And when we are talking about a cluster map, it's not only identifying the actors, but it's also about identifying their relationships and their interactions. Here I can share with you an example of a cluster map. Let us see. Now my screen got frozen. Here we go. So here we have as an example the cluster map from Cairns in Australia. It's the tourism cluster in Cairns. Now here we have in different colors different set of actors. The key actors that are in dark blue in the middle, those are, if you think about the tourism business, if you think about the needs of a tourist, well, visiting the location, the tourist will need some place to stay, So here we have the hotels, and of course, as we know, in today's world, hotels are not the only option. This is perhaps a bit, if we think about, this is from a 2003 student research back at Harvard Business School. Today, next to hotels, we could also be listing, for example, Airbnb type of housings. Of course, we could be listing also like camp places, campings, or other possibilities as well. Then, of course, as a tourist, you will be needing to eat something. So restaurants naturally are part of the key actors. How would you be getting to the location? Well, you will be needing airlines, or you would be perhaps using cruise ships as another important actor in the middle. Well, of course, while in Cairns, you would be looking for entertainment, to see some attractions, do some activities. I understand that Cairns is very famous for example, diving, with snorkel or with scuba diving. They have very nice coral areas. So you would be doing these kinds of activities, visiting places. So these are also key actors. Up, we have also kind of main actors, but perhaps a bit with light blue. Some of us will go there by ourselves, but others, they may be using some tour operators. We may have a booked, scheduled tour to visit there. Of course, we may be using some travel agents, either directly or indirectly. So when, for example, you are buying your tickets online, you may be using an agent if you are not buying directly your airline's ticket, like, for example, eBookers, etc. On the left, in orange, we have the suppliers to the key actors, especially for the hotels and the restaurants. Well, the hotels and the restaurants, they need services. So they need property and maintenance services. So, for example, cleaning or maintenance for certain breakdowns. Of course, they need food supplies. So the restaurants, especially, and hotels, they also have their own restaurants and bar. So they need their supplies, and also market research, marketing services, public relations services for especially the hotels. So those are the suppliers on the left in orange, and then on the right in yellow we have the related industries. So related industries here would mean, especially when we are thinking about the attractions and activities, we would need local transportation to get there. At the same time, of course, you may want to be buying some souvenirs for your loved ones back home. So souvenir shops, banks, you may want to, we can think about here, not as capital providers, but you may need to change money to the local currency. So there may be some exchange offices, foreign exchange offices for your need, and hopefully not, but there can also be the need for healthcare services if you happen to get sick. And of course, local retail, you'll be shopping similar to the souvenirs. You'll be shopping for some things for yourself. So those are the related industries for tourism. And then all the way down in green, we have the institutions for collaboration. So these include, for example, the government actors. We have the government agencies such as the Australian Tourism Commission. We have educational institutions, those colleges, universities, which have programs related to the tourism industry. So they may have a bachelor's and a master's program in tourism business. So those would be raising the skilled workforce for the cluster. And then we have also the industry group, the industry associations, councils, which kind of act as cluster organizations, bringing the different actors in the cluster together. We will look at these cluster organizations, their role, a bit later. It's taking a while as I'm trying to change the screen, the slides. Yes. So when we talk about clusters, we talk about two kinds of clusters. Local clusters, these happen to make more of the employment, but they happen to be less innovative, as we see in the figures, than traded clusters. So traded clusters have international operations. That means the products, the services that they produce, they will be exported, they can be exported to other markets as well. So they serve the global markets. And an example for the traded cluster would be, for example, the IT cluster. We can talk about Silicon Valley as an example, or any IT cluster in any part of the world. What we see from the statistics is that if, for example, as future graduates, you are thinking about your potential workplaces, I would definitely encourage you to think about a traded cluster versus a local cluster, because statistics tell us that in the traded cluster, you are more likely to earn more money. So this is an example from the US, that in the US, the traded clusters, the wages there are about 50% more than the local clusters. But at the same time, these knowledge-intensive clusters, they are also more likely to come up with innovations. So there is 91% more patents issued in traded clusters than local clusters in the US. That is very understandable. So those clusters which bring out more innovations are of course more likely to offer better opportunities, and they are more likely to offer better salaries. This is kind of an introduction on clusters. Now we will be moving into clusters policies and initiatives, but before getting there, let me share with you a couple of locations where you can access more information on clusters, more materials on clusters. So here under your group project, I shared with you a couple of links. One good link would be the link of the European Cluster Observatory. So let us click on that link. So here we have a classroom, library, data, and videos. So here under videos, you may want to watch. We have 3 series of videos on cluster dynamics, cluster policy, and cluster management. Here under I would say the classroom, there are some, for example, student projects that have been done. This may be helpful to see as examples for your group project. So I think the projects presented here are not exactly the same as what you are asked to do, but you would be perhaps you could be benefiting from what kind of work they have done. Make sure that you are not doing any one of these student projects as your group project. And here also in the classroom you can find some cases, or in the library you find some you can find some materials on when I say materials, these are mostly publications on cluster, some reports from different countries. I'm just checking through. There are different country reports, so you can find materials useful for your group project from this website of the Cluster Observatory. A second useful site that I recommend for you to check would be the US Cluster Mapping Project. So here, this is more about the US regions. So there is also a lot of information data for the US regions that you can see. So they have the data by region here, or by cluster. So there is also good amount of resources that you may check out, especially related to the US clusters and regions. So those are the two good sites what I could recommend for you for your group assignment. Any questions so far about the clusters?
No, not for me.
Okay. So we said that cluster policies, clusters have been identified as important policies for economic development in regions, in countries. Especially Silicon Valley was kind of a milestone to see how successful the companies from that cluster were, made many countries around the world to think about, okay, how can we develop similar clusters also in our countries? So that was kind of the trend for many country managers, policymakers, to develop cluster policies that would replicate the success of Silicon Valley. When we talk about clusters, here we talk about the difference between organic clusters and planned clusters. Silicon Valley was an organically developed cluster. When we think about its development, we see, okay, the role of the government to a certain extent, as, for example, the first technological developments that were developed in Silicon Valley were actually developed for the US military. So the US military made kind of an order for certain types of technological products, and the innovations that came from the region were indeed aiming the government as a buyer. So there was the government's influence as a funder of the innovations and as a buyer. But the more influential part was not the government there, but perhaps the universities. Especially we talk about the role of Stanford University, the engineering department, engineering school of Stanford University, taking a leadership role in coming up with the innovations and then in implementing these innovations in commercial markets. When we think about the university, the original mission of the university has always been education. So we educate students for the workplace. Then afterwards, after the first revolution, let's say the higher education revolution, the universities were also expected to create new knowledge by doing research activities. So that is in most places nowadays, universities have the dual role of education and research. But then starting with actually the first example for this was the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, and the second example is the Stanford University. What we see here is a second revolution of the higher education system. And the university now, especially in those cases, takes the role of not only education and research, but also entrepreneurship. So we see researchers from Stanford developing the innovations and then taking entrepreneurial roles to start their own companies with from these innovations. Very good example back in I would say early 1930s, 1940s would be the current HP Hewlett Packard, the computer company that still exists today. So that was the Mr. Hewlett and Mr. Packard. They were students at Stanford, and then they came up with the innovation, and they established their own company. So we see here, this is actually the backbone of the triple helix model, which emphasizes the university's key role in the development of innovations. We see here Stanford universities as an example of the entrepreneurial university main role in developing the Silicon Valley, the current Silicon Valley cluster. So this has been an organic development, meaning it has been a bottom-up process, not that the government has forced the development of the cluster, but it has emerged by itself organically. The planned version is more what many of the policymakers are trying to do in all around the world, and that is more of a top-down approach. So the government, like for example in Russia near Moscow, there is let's say the so-called now I don't remember the Russian name, the so-called Silicon Valley of Russia. So they are trying to replicate the Silicon Valley. Similar kind of activities, top-down planned activities, initiatives, we see also, for example, in China and in other parts of the world. So here we are talking about two kinds of roles: the top-down approach and the bottom-up approach. Now, the top-down approaches, like the initiatives in Russia or in China or any other country around the world, what we see is that none of them is able to replicate the success of Silicon Valley. And some of them even fail those initiatives. So what is the problem? Why can't we replicate Silicon Valley all around the world? Well, there are many explanations behind this. One is that by force, you cannot do same things in every location. So you cannot just replicate something all around the world. And especially what we said here, coming back, to the very beginning, location matters. So the culture in Silicon Valley is very different than the cultures in other parts of the world. When we talk about the Silicon Valley culture, we mentioned early on, I think when we were meeting still in the class, that in the US, they work 24/7. So the companies like Google, Facebook, which have their campuses in Silicon Valley, they have built everything inside their campuses that the workers, they don't need to leave the campus. So they work really hard, much more hours than compared with any others around the world. But at the same time, the culture is also very informal. So the communication between people from any company is quite much informal. People, they meet socially in outside of the workplace, if they happen to go outside of the workplace. And what we see is also that the moving of people from one company to another is also quite easy. Now, I compare it with, for example, here in Finland, if you lose your job for a reason, finding a job at another company is not so easy. So many people don't change their jobs for a long time. They stay with their current employers. Entrepreneurship, the approach to entrepreneurship, again, as part of the culture, is also different in Silicon Valley. What we can call there is different from other places is this failure culture. So how the people perceive failure is different there. So it's in that respect much easier for you to start your own business, because if you fail, then you are not stamped as a failure person, but you are rather seen as a person who has had the experience of starting up a new business. Even though you have failed, you may find a job in another company easily. So the labor dynamics is much easier. You just cross the street and you will start working for another company. That's how they call it there. And also the failure culture allows to benefit from the failures rather than see them as bad things. So in those respects, the trust between the different people, plus also the dynamics of the labor between companies, that is one explanation, the success of Silicon Valley as a highly innovative location. So bottom-up processes are perhaps more influential there than top-down processes. The government is maybe not so actively involved in these processes. We see more the industry and the research institutes and the universities, educational institutes, as key actors in the development of new innovations. Now, here we have a list of perhaps tests that will help us to decide whether, as policymakers, we should be developing a certain kind of a cluster in our region. Now, one of the concepts that has been developed in Europe in choosing which clusters initiatives to support and which not to support is called smart specialization. Regions, they have been given the power. So when I say regions, so if you think about Finland, we have different regions in Finland. So we are now currently in Jyväskylä in the region called Central Finland. We have the capital area region, then we have other regions also up in the north, in the west. So regions have the power and the resources to decide which cluster initiatives they would want to support, finance in their regions. And in deciding that, we should be thinking, so the specialization, the smart specialization, the word comes from smartly, cleverly choosing which areas, which clusters we want to specialize in our region. And in doing that, we should not be just following all the others, like all around the world. They are aiming to replicate Silicon Valley, so let's do it also here. That's not what we should be perhaps doing. Rather, we should think about what are the specific advantages of our region. So looking back from history, which have been the key clusters that have developed in this region. So if you look at the tests that are mentioned here, first one is, do we have already a critical mass of locally based companies or subsidiaries of foreign companies that are competitive in international markets? So meeting the market test means that those companies, local or subsidiaries of foreign companies in our region, are competitive in international markets. So if we have such a critical mass, well, why should we destroy that in order to, let's say, create a different initiative? So smart specialization requires that we look at what we have. If we have already a critical mass of a good cluster, internationally competitive cluster, we should support that cluster. We should build on the strengths of our region. Having a critical mass of competitive companies in our region is already a signal of what is our strength. So we should build on our strengths. That is the smart part in specializing the activities of our region. Do we, as a region, offer some cluster-specific, unique cluster-specific advantages that we can have, looking at, for example, the diamond of our region? So if we have some cluster-specific advantages, well, then we should invest in that cluster. So if we think about France, if we think about locations which are suitable for wine production, those already have specific advantages that would definitely make a strength for the region, which means that we should support, for example, the wine cluster of that region. So that is the second test. Then, of course, if we have a world-class multinational company which has already invested in our region, well, that is, of course, business people, they know what they are doing. They wouldn't invest if they don't see any clear advantages of that region. So if a world-class multinational company has already established its presence in the cluster, well, that's a very good sign that perhaps you should also support, as a policymaker, that cluster. Last, the fourth is, are there strong, closely related clusters to your cluster that you will support in that region? So if you are, as a policymaker, going to decide which of the clusters in our region we should support with initiatives, with funding, well, the decision that you will make, the cluster that you will choose, should meet at least two of these four criteria. So these are the tests that will allow policymakers in their decision making. This was about cluster policies and initiatives. Especially, we looked at what would be the criteria to decide which cluster initiatives as policymakers we should support. But let us, as perhaps potential future managers, look at how do we manage relationships in the cluster, so-called cluster management. Now, in this life cycle figure, what we see is that when we are developing the cluster, we are first bringing in together a set of actors. So on the left side, in the starting phase, so-called the hero phase, we have we have the set of actors, but as you see, those actors, they seem to be quite detached from each other. Now, how do we get these actors to cooperate with each other? So if you see on the very right side in the life cycle model, if we don't want that the cluster dies, so we see two possibilities. One is the museum scenario, where after a certain time, the cluster will decline and die. And we see the other scenario, the Renaissance scenario, where we see cluster actors actively, with the arrows that are between them, actively cooperate with each other. So when we talk about cluster management, we are actually talking about two things. One, how do we bring to the location more actors to make the cluster stronger? And two, how do we develop the interactions between those cluster members? So the second one is also is highly important, because as we are arguing, it is the interactions between the cluster actors, members, that will lead to innovations. Now, if we think about the top-down approach, if we think about the planned clusters, what we see is that the starting of the cluster will be, in those cases, by an external funding, which probably is provided by the local government, or sometimes nowadays, for example, in European cluster initiatives, we also see external funding from, for example, the European Union, so European level funds, to develop a certain cluster in a certain region. So usually when there is funding, people are interested to collaborate. So you come around the table, there is nice external funding to start develop cooperation inside the cluster. However, this kind of external funding cannot be forever, cannot last forever in order to keep the cluster together. What we need is, in time, a shift towards more internal funding, a shift towards leadership by the firms. If we think about the cluster concept, where the firms, the industry was in the middle, so they are, if we want our cluster initiatives to succeed, they should take the leadership of the cluster, and the funding should be changed from the external funding to internal funding, that the cluster should be self-sufficient to finance itself over the long term. So if a cluster is not able to achieve this transition, unfortunately, it is likely to go into the museum stage, museum scenario. Here again, we see what we are aiming to do with the clusters over time. We want more agglomeration on the x-axis. That is, we bring in more actors. And at the same time, on the y-axis, we want to develop more communication, more interaction between the actors in order to improve the competitiveness of the cluster. I would like to present here the gap model, which is perhaps helpful for us to understand how we can achieve the second objective. The model here is telling us that if we look at the actors in the cluster, so we have the big circle where we have the actors in the cluster, but we also have actors outside of the cluster. So there are 5 gaps inside the cluster and 2 additional gaps outside the cluster. And if we are cluster managers, if our aim is to develop interaction among the members, both inside the cluster and outside the cluster, we should be working towards bridging these gaps. So we have the gap between the firms. So the companies that are inside the cluster, we have the competitors, the suppliers, distributors. We have also the companies from related industries. How do we make them get together and work on joint projects? How do we make them to communicate and cooperate with each other in order to come up with new innovations? We have the gap, the so-called the research gap. Companies, they don't maybe want to cooperate with universities. Maybe they don't want to cooperate with research institutes. How do we make sure that there is more cooperation? If we think about the research institutes, is it that the researchers, the academics, they are interested only in publishing their research? So this is kind of the traditional perspective. So they are not interested in coming up with innovations that will that can be commercialized in cooperation with companies. So that is creating the research gap. So what the research institutes, universities are researching are completely out of sight of what the companies are interested in. So how do we close this gap so that companies and researchers, they work on projects, innovation projects that will improve the competitiveness of the cluster? So that is the research gap. Education gap. Do we have educational programs that are specific for the cluster? So if we are talking about the tourism cluster, do we have bachelor's, master's level programs that raise skilled workforce for the cluster? So if we think about the IT cluster, do we have some programs in IT that raise the skilled workforce? Of course, it's not only these degree programs, but we should also offer lifelong learning opportunities to upgrade the skills of the existing workforce. So how in line are the programs offered and the needs of the companies? Are the companies flexible to send their employees to attend these lifelong learning possibilities? If we think about countries like Russia, the culture there is thinking that, okay, if we send usually it's the companies which will be paying for the education, lifelong learning education programs of their employees. So in some countries like in Russia, they will be seeing if the company pays for the education of the employees, they will be seeing this as a as an additional cost, because they don't know in the future if the employees they leave the company, then they will it will be a lost cost. So they don't think of it like an investment for the future of the company, but they think of it as an additional cost, so they don't invest. That is the case, for example, in Russia. In Finland, perhaps this is different. Perhaps the difference comes basically that most of the education in Finland is free, and the companies offer the flexibility for the students, and they understand the importance of education for their employees to upgrade their skills. So there can be differences, creating different kinds of gaps between the firms and the education institutes. Capital gap, well, this is about how easily, when you have a new idea, new business idea as an entrepreneur, how easily can you access different types of capital? Or as a company, how easily can you access new capital? So that is regarding the capital gap. The government gap, perhaps when here we are perhaps talking more about the policymakers supporting the clusters initiatives in terms of not only funding, but also from legislative perspective, how open, how communicative are industry representatives with policymakers in the government. Here, we are not perhaps talking about individual company representatives, but usually they have associations, councils, which represent the interests of the companies, firms in the cluster. So this kind of collaborative communication between industry representatives, cluster representatives, and policymakers, that's the fifth gap in the cluster. But then, of course, we have been talking maybe mostly from this internal perspective. We should also remember that in today's more international, more global business world, we should also think about, especially in the context of traded clusters, the global market gap. So thinking of Finland as a small country with a small market, most of the traded clusters in Finland are in desperate need for early internationalization. So how do we create international possibilities, internationalization possibilities for all the actors in our cluster? So that means mostly when we talk about the market gap, we are thinking about more products and services that the firms are producing. But then when we think about the gap between clusters, we would be integrating all the other actors as well. Like, for example, we have the projects that aim to develop cooperation between the bioeconomy clusters in the Baltic Sea region. Currently, this is an ongoing project where the bioeconomy cluster of central Finland is developing cooperation with bioeconomy clusters in Norway, Latvia, Estonia, and Poland. And here, why do we need this kind of cooperation with different clusters? Well, of course, even though clusters are agglomeration in certain areas, in today's global world, we understand the need that we can also learn from other clusters around the world. And of course, proximity here matters. The project that I mentioned to you is still a geographically close area around the Baltic Sea. So you first want to cooperate with actors that are still close by to you. This kind of cooperation can bring new knowledge to the cluster, can bring new innovations to the clusters, and also can bring new business opportunities. Understanding this is very important, but at the same time, we should also realize that bridging all these gaps is very challenging. If we do not have an actor who will take care of this cluster management, and we just leave it to these actors to manage their gaps, we may not get the desired results. In that respect, what we see as a major development in many clusters is the emergence of cluster organizations. So as you see the numbers, starting from the 2000s, we see an increasing number of cluster organizations, and cluster organizations are organizations which are aiming to develop more interaction between actors in the cluster, and also between the cluster and the external parties, such as we mentioned here, the global markets, and also other similar clusters in international, in different countries. So here, the cluster organizations are simply aiming to bridge the existing gaps that we just talked about. And for this, the organizations, they have the so-called the cluster manager. So what we see as the cluster manager as a key person, very impossible to perhaps have all the characteristics that are mentioned in the list in one person, but this is a very challenging position as a facilitator, as a leader, to bring in actors with diverse backgrounds, diverse interests, to cooperate with each other. So this is a very challenging task. Cluster management is very challenging, and that is perhaps why we see that not all clusters succeed. We see why it's not easy to replicate the success of, for example, Silicon Valley. So that is in brief the session about clusters. We have learned today what clusters are, that many countries have initiated cluster policies to develop economic development, economic growth in their locations. These are planned activities. They are planned clusters. We saw in choosing which clusters we want to promote, we should be thinking about the strengths of our region. That's what we call smart specialization. If we think about Central Finland, in Central Finland, the three key clusters that are the specialization areas of Central Finland is one, the bioeconomy cluster, that includes the forest cluster. So we see that it's a logical, smart choice, because Central Finland is not only full of forests, but it is also the home for leading worldwide, highly competitive forest companies, such as, for example, Valmet. We have highly competitive multinational Finnish companies that are established in Central Finland in this cluster. So that is one of the three key clusters. The second key cluster of Central Finland is the IT cluster. So Finland, Central Finland offers is one of the key locations where IT-related education is offered at the university and also at the University of Applied Sciences. So we have not all programs are offered in all universities around Finland. So Central Finland, the University of Jyväskylä and JAMK, where you are studying, are locations where we offer IT-related education. So that is one of the focus areas of Central Finland. And thirdly, it is the third important cluster of Central Finland is the education cluster. Jyväskylä is known as the city where the first teacher education in Finnish language started, and back in history. So coming with the tradition, the teacher education college at JAMK is highly reputable, and also Jyväskylä University is very well known for its education and research in the field of education. So we have altogether as the two university and the University of Applied Sciences a high number of students, as you have probably realized during your stay here. This is a university town with a lot of young students as compared to the population of the city. And finally, we looked at cluster management. We looked at the internal dynamics of the cluster. We saw challenges for the cluster managers, how to increase the number of actors in the cluster at the one hand, and at the other hand, how to increase the cooperation, the interactions, the dynamics between different actors of the cluster, how to, by bridging the gaps that were shared with us in the gap model. So these were the key elements of the lecture today. Perhaps I would draw your attention once more to your group project when you will be studying a certain cluster in a certain country or a region in your group assignment. You will be making the cluster map of your cluster, telling about who are the key actors and their relationships. So you will be benefiting, hopefully, from the cluster map of the tourism cluster that was shared here in the slides. So I'm looking forward to see something like this when you are presenting the cluster members in the profile of the cluster. You will be assessing the cluster's competitiveness using the diamond model. So the diamond model can also be applied at cluster level, and that is what is asked from you. Remember, I would like to see we had in the model this kind of a 4 quadrants. There is this one slide for each quadrant, factor conditions, for example, demand conditions, etc. We want to see what are the strengths and what are the weaknesses, the pluses and the minuses. So let me share with you. That slide. So that is what I would like to see also based on your analysis. I would like to see, this is for the quality of the business environment, but I would like to see it for the competitiveness of your cluster using the diamond model. I would like to see for each of these quadrants what are the pluses and what are the minuses. Then what is requested from you is identification of key competitiveness issues facing the cluster. So this, the identification of the key issues, and here I want you to focus on, I would say, maximum 3 key issues. You cannot deal with tens of key issues, because in the last part, you will be sharing recommendations to increase the competitiveness. So these would be like solutions to the key issues. So identify maximum 3 key issues facing the cluster, and these issues should come up from your analysis of the diamond model. So here, what I am asking you to do is to look at the minuses. So if you look at the minuses, out of all the weaknesses that you list, what are the 3 key weaknesses that you would like to raise as the 3 challenges for development, and then you come up with recommendations to improve those. So here I suggest that you benefit from the diamond model and the cluster concept in making your group project. I guess we are now good with our time. Do you happen to have any questions?
No, that's here.
Yeah.
That's at home.
Okay, in that case, next week we have our first case analysis. I am looking forward to receive your individual assignments for the Finland and Nokia case under the return box. So you'll just click there and upload your Word document or PDF document, whichever you prefer, to that by 9:30 Finnish time. So that is the task now that's in front of us. Also start thinking about your selected cluster and region or country. So next week I will ask from each group what is their selected cluster. So we will also spare some time for that. So I wish you all a nice day, and see you next week. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
See you,
Bye.
Murat, next week. Bye bye.
Yes, bye. All the best.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye. Il a dit quoi?